Hello, welcome to Wendy's Classic Corner. I'm Wendy, and last week we discussed film noir on the show. This week, we want to talk about other noirs that fall outside the film noir category. These noirs can range from neo-noirs, western noirs, and foreign noirs. Let's get into it. I do want to start out by mentioning that if you missed our show last week, you can always catch our episodes on my YouTube channel, Wendy's Classic Corner. You can also do a search for Wendy's Classic Corner on pctv21.org under the Watch Live tab. In that show, we discussed the typical elements of film noir, including an anti-hero, a femme fatale, and a crime. We also discussed stylistic elements, such as filming in black and white, shadows, smoke, and contrast lighting. Today, in our other noirs, we're going to talk more about themes. It's still possible for these films to have stylistic and plot elements from film noir, but in our other noirs, they are not quite so cut and dry, and we have a much broader definition to work with. Some themes common to noirs are loneliness and isolation, paranoia, despair. Characters are often struggling with a purpose or have a moral dilemma. To put it another way, our main character is usually not a very happy guy. That extends to the other characters in the film as well. Most are world-weary and cynical. I want to start out discussing neo-noirs, since, as I mentioned in our last show, film noir references a very specific time frame, 1940 to 1958. Films with similar noir elements after that time are referred to as neo-noirs. These films can be in color and have updated themes and visuals. Neo is translated to new, so these films are new as in more modern noirs as opposed to classic film noir. I particularly like neo-noirs as they still tend to have a lot of the same plot characteristics as film noir. I'm going to talk today about two neo-noirs that I particularly like. And don't worry, we will still be covering foreign noirs and western noirs when we chat with our viewers. Let's start out with possibly my favorite neo-noir, 1962's The Manchurian Candidate. The Manchurian Candidate is still in black and white, with many of the beautiful stylistic film noir elements such as innovative camera angles, which helps show a skewed and distorted perception that the character is experiencing. Our main character is an anti-hero, and we have a femme fatale leading our anti-hero astray, though this is a very different kind of femme fatale. We have lots of crimes. What makes The Manchurian Candidate unique is the political thriller aspect of this film. This film was produced by Frank Sinatra and directed by John Frankenheimer. The Manchurian Candidate was based on a novel by Richard Condon and adapted by George Axelrod. I think it's important to note the editor of this film, Ferris Webster, as he was nominated for an Oscar for his work on this film, specifically in the merging the brainwashing sequences, which we'll talk about later. Frank Sinatra also stars in this film, and this is not the Frank Sinatra of the light comedy musicals of the 1940s. By the late 1950s, early 1960s, Frank had become a quality dramatic actor, and he shows off his acting chops in this particular film. Frank always felt he worked best on the first take, so he had a clause in his contract that only the first takes were to be used throughout the film, unless there was a technical problem. Despite the great performance Frank gives in this film, he is still only third best in my opinion when it comes to performances. Angela Lansbury gives a chilling, against-type performance in this film, and in fact was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. If you are familiar with Angela Lansbury from Murder, She Wrote, you will be in for a shock when you see her in this film. This really speaks to her versatility, and though Frank had wanted Lucille Ball for this role, I can't imagine anyone else being able to convey such a cold and calculating, narcissistic character to such perfection. Lastly, this film revolves around our main character, Raymond Shaw, played by Lawrence Harvey. Lawrence Harvey is an underrated, not especially well-known actor who is able to convey characters' thoughts with the subtlest of facial expressions. There's a specific part in the film where Marco, who is played by Frank Sinatra, is hypnotizing Raymond, and Lawrence Harvey somehow makes his eye tick to convey extreme horror, and it's very effective. It's just one small example of the immense talent of Lawrence Harvey. We see in the beginning of the film that Raymond Shaw is a sergeant in the Army stationed in South Korea and very disliked by the men in his platoon. The platoon is led into a trap by their Korean scout. The film then goes on to show Raymond Shaw coming home to great acclaim, having won the Congressional Medal of Honor for saving his entire platoon. We are also now introduced to his mother, a domineering woman who is the political force behind his hapless senator stepfather. His mother, Eleanor, played by Angela Lansbury, who was a mere 3 years older than Lawrence Harvey, can't resist the chance to get some publicity by having press and fanfare at Raymond's arrival back home. It becomes very clear that Raymond despises both his mother and his stepfather. Meanwhile, Major Marco, Frank Sinatra, who was also a member of Raymond's platoon, keeps having a reoccurring nightmare that centers around the platoon being on a stage behind a speaker. The speaker and the audience change between a ladies' gardening club and a communist organization. This is where the impressive editing can be seen. The members of the platoon are in a state of hypnosis and do whatever the speaker tells them to do, including murdering members of the other platoon. Raymond is singled out for these type of tasks. Marco feels that something is wrong with these dreams. He tries to convey his concerns to the higher-ups in the Army, but he is not believed. He decides to pay a call to Raymond Shaw and manages to befriend him. But someone else is also visiting Raymond, the communist speaker from Korea. He uses the Queen of Diamonds from a deck of cards to brainwash Raymond and make him commit various murders, mostly political in nature. This film has a very extreme and emotionally impactful ending, and the entire film is very suspenseful and just an artistic masterpiece. I highly recommend you check out The Manchurian Candidate. As I mentioned in my first show, don't forget about checking your local library. Even if they don't have the DVD or Blu-ray there, they can often get it ordered from another library and sent to you. My next pick for Neo-Noir is a color noir, 1967's Point Blank, directed by John Berman, and starring Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson. Though not shot in black and white, this film is very visually beautiful with stunning widescreen views of San Francisco and Santa Monica. We have our anti-hero Walker, who has no first name, played by Lee Marvin. You would think that thugs and criminals would know not to mess with Lee Marvin, but our villains in this film have not learned that lesson. There are a lot of flashbacks in this film, and in fact, it can be a little confusing in the beginning. The film pretty much starts off with Lee Marvin getting shot in a cell in Alcatraz. We learn bit by bit that he has been dragged into a heist by his friend, Mal Reese, and his wife, Lynn. Mal is desperate for money. He apparently owes money to someone and begs Walker to help him with the heist. He then finds out the money they recover is not as much as he had thought. This causes Mal to eliminate Walker, thus ensuring more money for him and also making it easier for Mal to continue carrying on his affair with Lynn. However, a vital mistake has been made. Walker was not killed and manages to get himself out of Alcatraz. He later winds up on a boat doing a tour of Alcatraz where he meets with a fellow calling himself Yost, played by Keenan Wynn. Yost alleges to be after Mal and members of a criminal organization he is affiliated with. He claims to want to help Walker in finding these guys, but Walker is not especially receptive. Walker then bursts into Lynn's house looking for Mal, but finds that he is not there and that he has, in fact, left Lynn. Lynn is depressed and gives us a helpful background with flashbacks on how they have come to this point. She then winds up killing herself. Walker proceeds to track down Lynn's sister, Chris, played by Angie Dickinson, to enlist her help in finding Mal. Apparently, Mal has a thing for Chris, and Walker doesn't hesitate to use her as a pawn to get to Mal. This plan is successful, and Walker learns who other important members of the organizations are. We also learn that Walker intends to get his $93,000 that he was supposed to earn in the heist. He continues to track down the men Mal mentioned from the organization and systematically causes their demise one by one. Walker also has some time to spare for Chris, and they become involved. This film also features Carroll O'Connor, best known for his role as Archie Bunker, as Brewster, one of the organization bad guys. Walker does do a lot of sitting on couches and looking catatonic in this film. Point Blank also has a bit of a surprise at the end and an oddly anticlimactic and vague ending that basically leaves the interpretation up to the viewer. Lee Marvin is excellent in this film as a vigilante type, and you can often sense his despair. There is a very powerful scene between Chris and Walker where, after they become intimately involved, she asks him, "What's my last name?" Walker hesitates for a minute and asks, "What's my first name?" Their expressions really convey their own misery and lack of self-worth. It's a pretty poignant scene, to me, maybe the most poignant scene in the film. Point Blank has the feel of a low-budget, late 1960s style film, but the incredible screen presence of Lee Marvin and the gorgeous cinematography, along with the suspenseful pacing and stylistic flashbacks, really carry this film. I hope you can check out Point Blank for yourself. Hello. Sounds good. Send them in. Well, folks, we're going to hear what our viewers have to say. First up, we have reoccurring guest Kirk. He's going to be dropping by the studio today. Hi, Kirk. Thank you for coming by. I hear you're going to tell us a little bit about some foreign noirs.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for having me back. When you mentioned that you were discussing different categories of noir this episode, I was eager to come back and talk about a genre that I've recently only discovered for myself, but have gotten really excited about. In the late 1950s through early 1970s, the Nikkatsu Corporation, Japan's oldest movie studio, produced a series of films that were heavily influenced by the French New Wave, as well as American westerns and crime films. These anachronistic noir-like productions were known as Nikkatsu action or borderless action, or as Criterion refers to them in their collected set, Nikkatsu noir. One of those films I want to discuss today is 1967's A Cold as Our Passport, directed by Takashi Nomura. This movie tells the story of Kamimura, a professional hitman hired to assassinate a powerful crime lord. After the job is finished, Kamimura and his partner Shun plan to leave the country to lay low and avoid the inevitable repercussions. They are initially captured by henchmen of the murder kingpin on their way to the airport, but through some ingenuity and foresight on Kamimura's part, they are able to escape. With the airports not too heavily watched, their only other chance of escape by sea. However, their plan is further compromised when their employers decide to join forces with the rival gang and offer Kamimura up as a peace offering and sacrificial lamb. Now the pair must hide out at a local truck stop motel, and with the assistance of a barmaid named Mina, find a way to escape the country on their own. As I mentioned, one of the big influences on the films is American westerns, and here that is most evident from the score. From the opening moments of the movie, we hear twin guitars, harmonicas, and whistling that would seem much more at home in a Sergio Leone spaghetti western than a modern Japanese crime film. The music follows the characters, specifically Kamimura himself, which reinforces his role as the stoic, lonely, John Wayne-type hero. Kamimura is played by Joe Shishido, one of Nikkatsu's most popular stars of the era. When we talked about The Killing last time, I mentioned how important the character's look is to the noir film, and Shishido definitely has a very unique look. Early in his career, he underwent cheek augmentation surgery, and it resulted in an unforgettable appearance. Although his face has been described as chipmunk-like, he has a rugged, battle-hardened visage that always makes him look dangerous and unpredictable, regardless of the role he's playing. Most of the characters I've seen Shishido play have been pragmatic, cold-blooded criminal types, but Kamimura is different. He's an atypical noir hero in that although he's an assassin and killer, he's not just out for himself, and he puts the needs and well-being of his friends ahead of his own. His relationship with his sidekick Shun is actually really sweet, and a nice change of pace from the cutthroat interactions we're used to seeing in this genre. There's a real big brother, little brother bond between them. Shun is young and impulsive, and his older and more experienced partner is constantly looking out for him and keeping him out of trouble. There's a real tender moment when Shun falls asleep in the motel and Kamimura takes the time to cover him up with a blanket. It's not the kind of stuff we're used to seeing in these movies, and it foreshadows the compassion Kamimura will show for Shun later in the film. I should also mention that Shun is played by Jerry Fujito, who was not only a famous actor, but a famous singer in Japan as well. he's given the chance to sing in this film. I bring it up because the scene is very reminiscent of Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson's song from Rio Bravo, yet another example of the direct influence American Westerns had on the film. Our third character is Mina, the truck stop barmaid. The film lacks the traditional noir femme fatale, but Mina is one of the most interesting characters in the movie and is given a lot to do. She originates from the poverty-stricken barge people, a group that lives on the boats in the nearby river, and her connection to them will play a vital role in the escape. She's also in a forced relationship with one of the local gangsters who also happens to be hunting down Kamimura and who previously murdered her lover. Oftentimes, the female lead character of a noir is motivated by her greed or her passion for the protagonist, but Mina's motivations are much more personal and make her a more well-rounded and relatable character. Thematically, the movie deals with the ideas of loyalty and responsibility. Kamimura's bosses are ultimately responsible for his safety, but after he completes the job, they betray him and his loyalty by selling him out to their enemies. Or as they put it, they choose money over morals. This is juxtaposed by the loyalty Kamimura and Shun display for each other throughout the movie, and the length that Kamimura ultimately goes to keep Shun safe, regardless of the cost to himself. We also see that idea of responsibility, specifically responsibility to and for oneself, reflected in the character of Mina. At the start of the film, she is lost, living a life dictated by people and circumstances around her. As the story progresses, she seeks to shake off the bondage of her past and forge the life she desires for herself. So if you're interested in alternative or foreign language noirs, this is a great place to start. Japanese cinema has a lot to offer in the genre, and if you're like me, it won't take you much to get you hooked. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Kirk. And our next guest will be Jim, who's also visited us today. Hi, Jim. Welcome to Wendys Classic Corner. Jim's going to also be talking about a neo-noir. What neo-noir do you want to tell us about, Jim?
It's one of my favorite neo-noirs. It's Chinatown. It may be the best of all neo-noirs, actually. It was made in 1974 and directed by Roman Polanski. It was nominated for 7 Golden Globe Awards, and it won 4 of them for Best Picture, Best Actor, Jack Nicholson, Best Director, Roman Polanski, and Best Screenplay, Robert Towne. It was also nominated for 11 Academy Awards, and it won just 1 for Best Screenplay for Robert Towne. But just the fact that it was nominated for 11 makes it a picture worth watching. Jack Nicholson plays the lead role here. He's a private investigator, Jake Geddes, and all the action in this film is filmed through his eyes. He's in every scene of the movie, even including a time when somebody comes up from behind him and knocks him out. And you can see his vision is fading out, and then it goes black, and then you see a blurred motion when he comes to, and he recovers a little bit. Faye Dunaway is the lead actress. She's played by Evelyn Mulray. And John Huston plays Evelyn's father, and his role is Noah Cross. He's perhaps the most evil role he's ever been in, I think. He's also a famous director, and he's also appeared in different films over the years. But in this one, he's truly evil. He really is bad. The atmosphere of this movie is very dark, and part of it is due to Jerry Goldsmith's music score. He composed and completed this music score in 10 days. And one of the things about it is the haunting trumpet solos that are all through this film score. And Goldsmith told the trumpeter he wanted to play it sexy, but as if it's not good sex. And that's the way it was. And it added to the atmosphere of this film. The atmosphere of this film was just perfection. I mean, it was, the time period is 1937, and you look at the cars, the architecture that they used, the apartments and so forth, the offices, just the entire environment about it, the suits they were wearing, the clothes they were wearing, it's just perfect. It just puts it in the right time period. It's based on the story is based on the California water wars of the early 20th century, but this is not a docudrama. This is a fiction, and it's set in 1937. And that's where everything just fits perfectly for that time period. A little bit about the story. A woman comes to Jake's office and she says her name is Evelyn Mulray. And she hires him to find out if her husband is having an affair. She explains that her husband is going to be at a public hearing later that day. And Jake goes to that public hearing. And then he finds out that, her husband, Hollis Mulray, is the chief engineer for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And in this hearing, there's a dam that's being proposed, being built in a certain area. And Hollis Mulray comes out and he says he will never build this dam. He says it's unsafe. It's not built in a place that could be have a safe dam construction, and he didn't want to be responsible for any accidents or dam breaks or anything like that happening later. But after the hearing, Jake follows Mulray, and he goes to an apartment where he meets with a young woman. Jake photographs the couple together. The next day, he gives the pictures to his client. And later in the day, he finds out that the pictures are in the newspaper. And the pictures are there to discredit Mulray and his testimony that he gave at the hearing. Soon after, the real Evelyn Mulray, played by Faye Dunaway, comes into the office and threatens to sue him. And at this stage, they argue back and forth, and later in the day, they find out that Hollis Mulray has been murdered or found dead, presumably drowned. And at this point, Jake and Faye Dunaway get together and they decide that he will be hired to find out what was the true cause of death in this. Well, it goes on and on. The movie goes on. There's several more scenes in the movie where there's another murder in the movie. And it comes to a rather surprise ending. And it takes place in the part of town called Chinatown of LA. And there's a tragic accident at the end of the movie, and Jake is pulled away by one of his associates from the scene of the crime, from the event that happened there, and his buddy says to him, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown," which means something like nobody cares about what goes on in Chinatown. And that's the feeling of the noir. It's a very dark noir, and I'd highly recommend it for anybody who's never seen it.
Thanks, Jim. And lastly, we have Tim. Welcome to Wendys Classic Corner. Tim is going to talk about Western Noirs today. Tim, what Western Noir do you have for us?
So the movie I get to talk about this week is in the Western Noir category. I'm picking the 1952 classic, High Noon. It was directed by Fred Zinnemann, who was a two-time Best Director Award winner. This movie is roughly based on the Tin Star. It's a magazine article that was by a writer named John Cunningham. The producer, Stanley Kramer, kind of wanted to go ahead and make sure he had the rights to it, so he went ahead and bought it so there wouldn't be any issue. It kind of gets interesting here because the writer, Carl Foreman, actually had wrote also on the Bridge Over River Kwai, but anyone who knows the McCarthyism era, Foreman was kind of one of the victims of that. So when it come time to writing the screenplay, Stanley Kramer and him kind of got together, and Kramer said, "You know what? Just go for it." So a lot of this script caused some controversy. John Wayne had actually said it's the most un-American thing that he had ever seen, which got him to go with Howard Hawks, and they did Rio Bravo as kind of their answer to this movie. So anyone who knows kind of the communist scare, with McCarthy and them, that's kind of what it was. So the take on the script here is typically a Western is the civilized townfolk would get together, follow the sheriff, and get rid of the undesirables. This is kind of a little bit of a turn, the undesirables coming into the town, and the good people, business people, church people have kind of turned their back on the civilized sheriff who saved their town from the get-go. So if you look at it from the get-go, if we take the plot, it's simplistic in every aspect to start with. It's revenge. Will Kane, Gary Cooper arrested Frank Miller, put him in jail, sent him upstate. Again, the organization, the politicians it would be alluded to, have set him free. So that's the simple plot. Now, this is where it starts to take this amazing turn, and if you stick with it, so it starts with them, one of Miller's gangs and his brother riding into town to the train station. So the train agent actually gets a telegraph, and he takes it to our sheriff, who amazingly happens to just be getting married on the exact day that he's coming into town. So that's where it starts to turn. So he's coming in within around 2 hours, which is kind of cool about the movie because it almost runs in real time to connect with what's going on. So that helps with the movie, but then we start adding to the plot that the sheriff is retiring. The new sheriff isn't coming till tomorrow. And the sheriff is leaving, Kane is leaving because his new wife is a Quaker, and they rush him out of town. And it leaves him there saying, well, if the guy comes in, he only wanted you, it's not going to be a real big issue. So as they leave, to kind of round it up, he has a moral dilemma as that guy, Frank Miller, is going to come get us no matter where we are. You know, I can't leave these people because that's my moral obligation, which is a big plot point, you know, with him. And it plays into it because he has a wife who doesn't want violence. And so there's that inner conflict of, oh my God, I could lose the woman I love. I could die and never get to be her husband, but I'm obligated to do this. So he comes back to town. Now you think that's the whole plot twist. It gets even better, which is just crazy as it goes along, that he gets there. And so the deputy sheriff, who he didn't recommend to be sheriff, he talks to him, and the deputy sheriff's like, listen, you put in a good word for me, I'll gladly help you. Otherwise, you're on your own. So that's the recurring theme of him trying to get these townspeople to help him, to go through it. So this kind of falls into where we say the Western Noir, and we'd struggled about how do we tie it in, or what exactly is that genre, because it basically says we took two and we've just crammed them together. This has the elements, you know, but what it does have that causes it not to quite fall into everything is it's crunched with time, because it runs in real time, and they use the clock inserts and the ticking of the clock instead of the shots, the dark shots, the close-in shots, to build that sense of tension. You know, it's not your typical American Western. I think it kind of evolved the characters because you get to see him struggle with his identity, you know, what's to do, what's right, to sacrifice what he needs to do. So, you know, again, I appreciate, you know, your time letting me talk about it. You know, us movie nuts, we got to spread the word. So I do appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you guys again. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. I've really enjoyed discussing Other Noirs with you and hope our viewers have enjoyed the show. And remember, if you want to be a guest on the show, you simply have to follow Wendys Classic Corner on Facebook or email me at wendysclassiccorner@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Wendy from Wendys Classic Corner saying so long, and here's looking at you, kid.
Why go anywhere else for classic movies?